Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first series of the series Humans and Wildlife, which is very exciting. I'm doing this together, co-hosting it with Georgia Oteri, and today it's going to be all about bats, which is actually her speciality. It's very exciting. So I'm actually going to be the one who interviews Georgia. So welcome, Georgia.
Hi, well, thank you. Thank you to us, I guess, for hosting me. But this was a good idea on your part as well, Christian. I appreciate it.
This is going to be super exciting. So, as you know, I used to talk a lot about eagles and so on. So it's been a lot about birds, but I've always wondered about bats, and I honestly know very little about bats. You know, there's always the assumption are bats like birds or birds like bats and so on, and that's something we're going to discuss here in detail. So I'm going to hand it right over to Georgia. Georgia, tell us a little bit about your background. How did you actually get interested in bats?
Yeah, so that's a really cool question because it relates sort of to what you just said, which is that you didn't know very much at all about them. And what first got me interested in them is that I realized that they're these animals that are all around us that I didn't know very much about because compared to birds, it's just so difficult to see them. You also, well, especially, I guess I should say, I'm in the northern United States, and we don't have any big fruit bats that are hanging around outside in trees and stuff like that that are visible during the day. So here where I am, there's a lot of bats around, but you almost never see them. And even though they're flying all around at night, you also don't hear them because their echolocations, their calls that they make, are so high frequency that they're actually above the range of human hearing. So it was kind of amazing to me. I was helping, I was like an intern helping with these salamander surveys, and the bat survey people needed help one night. So I was like, yeah, I can stay up late. I'm like young, whatever, stay up all night, catch some bats. And I just couldn't believe it. We've set up these big nets. This was in North Carolina in the eastern United States. We set up these big nets. They're like really tall, like volleyball nets or something. They're like the nets that you would use to catch birds, if you're familiar. But we set them up at night, and like very quickly, we just had like, a bunch of different bats in them, different species. The like trained biologists were like untangling the bats from the nets and then looking at them and like seeing what species they were and then letting them go. And I was just like, wow, like what are all these little guys doing around here? Like I had no idea. So I think, yeah, that's what really kind of got me hooked at first, was just that here was this thing that had been all around me all my life. And like I didn't really know about it. It was kind of like discovering like a secret world or something.
So, Georgia, that's very interesting because I haven't actually observed much wildlife at night. So, are you actually a nocturnal animal?
Actually, no, I'm not. And this has been the great struggle for me of my life, is that I naturally kind of wake up very early. I'm a morning person. I love the mornings. And so I would say like when I was a bit younger, it didn't bother me quite as much, but studying bats kind of regularly, like being out there every night, having these really long field seasons where you're just permanently sort of shifting your schedule. That was really hard on me. Like I kind of miss having a beer on a summer evening. And, I think anybody that works night shift, a lot of people can probably relate. You're kind of waiting for your workday to begin throughout the day. You can only unwind to a certain degree. And yeah, so I don't do as much field work anymore. And when I was younger, I kind of handled the sleep schedule shift better. And now I kind of, as you get older, you have some more privileges where you have more people to help with your research and more friends who you can be like, hey, are you doing any surveys in this area? Oh, could you maybe get some samples for me? Or tell me what you find there. And so now that I'm older, another thing I do is I rely a lot more on collaborations to try to collect data more efficiently, I would say.
I'm just going to quickly say, because Georgia obviously is talking and I'm reading more of the comments here. So I'm just saying hello to everyone. Irena, Amanda, wonderful to see you here. Pilot Man, wonderful. Susan, Olaf, Kit, very nice to see you. Reading, really wonderful to see you all. Frankman and so on. So I hope I haven't left anyone else. Please feel free to put your comments in. We're very excited to get Georgia to answer these. So Georgia, let's dive a little bit into your research. I mean, I read there about 1,400 species of bats. I was completely knocked out when I read that. I had no idea. So obviously that is not, there's no way you could study all of them. What are you actually doing?
Yeah, so right now I'm working on my PhD. I'm a year out from finishing it, and I've been for my PhD pretty much exclusively focused on one species, and that species is the little brown bat. Its scientific name is Myotis lucifugus, which it translates lucifugus is something like Lucifer, right? Like part of its Latin name comes from like little demon, which is what pretty much what people think of bats, and we can get some more into what people think of
Mhm.
bats in terms of mythology and stuff later, if people in the comments are interested in particular. But my research now is about how the little brown bats are dealing with this disease called white nose syndrome.
Right.
And so I'm curious if people in the comments have heard of it. Actually, let us know if you have or have not heard of it. It's a disease caused by a fungal pathogen that was introduced to North America. And basically, this fungus was brought over by people, and it's a species of fungus that specializes on growing in caves. And so the fungus like grows on the bats when they're trying to hibernate in the caves here in North America. And it basically wakes the bats up when they're trying to hibernate, and then they die during hibernation. And so I'm studying how the bats respond to that disease, and in particular, if they're evolving in response to the disease.
Yeah, that's very interesting, George, that you mentioned straight away. So please put those comments if you've ever heard of the, what is it, the white nose syndrome, isn't it, right? That's what it is called. I only honestly, I have just heard about it yesterday. Okay, so I'm very honest about it. I didn't know this, and now I know it because I prepared myself for this. But it's I certainly didn't know about it. But let's talk a little bit more about the difference between bats and birds. Let's talk a bit about evolution. Where bats evolved from, and why are they different to birds, Georgia?
Yeah, so, well, some obvious things come to mind, like bats are primarily active at night, and there are some night active birds as well, but in general, more birds are active during the day than are active at night. And so, one reason that people think bats are active at night is because birds kind of evolved first before bats, and they took over the
Hmm.
skies. And birds are actually very good flyers, right? Like they're very agile and maneuverable. Most birds, if they wanted to, could probably easily catch a bat, I think, or a lot of them could. And so, especially like the hawks, and there's some like birds like bat falcons that specialize on eating bats. So bats are primarily active at night. And I mentioned that there's some differences in maneuverability. Well, part of that is because of the differences in how their wings are shaped, their wing morphology. And so bats have wings where they've preserved a lot of their finger bones in the wings,
Yes.
whereas birds over the course of evolution have lost a lot of those bones. So I guess we should kind of back up a second and say, bats' wings are basically their hands, right? Just like a whale's flippers are kind of, those also come from hands and the hand bones and stuff. And we have, some pictures here, and maybe we can get rid of
Yeah, I
some
will
of
try. I will try and give me
I
just
think
a
I
second.
can get rid of,
Try.
a couple of these other ones maybe.
There we go. Excellent.
Oh,
Thank you.
yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Beautiful bat picture. I love it. So you can see this bat has really big ears. So those are those two like things on top pointing out. And then it has its arms stretched out, or its wings stretched out. And it has those lines kind of coming down from its wings. Those are its fingers. And then it has one tiny little claw on the top sticking up, kind of where the wing is bent, and that's its little, like, its tiny little thumb. So
Yes.
yeah, so the bats they fly through this thin membrane that's like stretched across their hands, basically. And then there's, if I might quickly interject, we have this. So this joke, I don't know if you know what jazz hands are. That's like when you're at the theater and you're like, ah, when in the musicals or whatever.
Yes.
So there's this meme we say sometimes. Basically, bats fly through the power of jazz hands because they're just out there like this all night long.
Hmm.
And if you see them in the skies flying, they are kind of, I mean, in some senses, they're very agile flyers. They can do like flips in the air and catch insects and stuff like that. And actually, if I put up this image that you had before, you
Yep.
see how even the bat's tail has a membrane. Some
Yes.
species of bat, they will catch the insect in their tail membrane. Like they'll kind of scoop it up and then you eat it from their tail membrane very quickly. So they can be quite agile, but if you look at them, that you can tell that they are kind of in another sense just sort of like floating around, kind of like they look a bit chaotic and sporadic. Um, and I think it's because like their wings just aren't sort of as like aerodynamic and fine-tuned as birds.
Yeah,
Um,
Georgia, but I'm a little bit surprised you say that because I'm absolutely amazed at the maneuverability of bats and the way they can catch insects. So if you tell me they're not that good at flight, I would nearly disagree,
yeah, well,
at least from observation.
yeah, maybe it's a bit relative, right? So certainly, like many birds could catch a bat, and birds can go
Okay.
fast, and they can go like sort of in a straightforward fashion, like towards what they want. There are no bats that fly good in that way. There's no bats that fly like a hawk, where they're like, sort of aerodynamic, like pew.
Yeah, that
Um,
makes sense. I understand. Or a peregrine
yeah, yeah.
falcon, right? So yes.
Yeah, so these
Yeah.
kind of like fluttery
Mhm.
around movements,
Mhm.
they can be quite good if you're not really going that fast, but you're trying to fly around like leaves and a lot of branches or something in the forest. Um, then it can be better. You're sacrificing maneuverability for speed, basically.
Yeah,
But
that
I mean,
makes
but like I mentioned, they have like their little somersaults and their flips and stuff like
That
that.
makes complete sense. So let's talk a
Yeah.
bit about the myths of bats. And by the way, gentlemen, ghosts, and so on. I saw your question. We're going to get to the question of diseases very soon. So please don't hesitate to put in further questions. We are taking note of them. So let's talk a bit about the myths of bats. You are as blind as a bat. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so well actually here, maybe we can go, do you want to read off some of the myths you have written first? And
Oh
people,
yes,
if you have particular opinions, you can type in the comments what
yes.
you think about that myth.
That's a good one. So I found four typical myths. The first one is as blind as a bat, or the second one is bats fly into people's hairs. Right? That's quite well known. The third one that I found, bats pose a major threat of rabies to humans, and the fourth ones are a bat is a sort of a flying mouse. Yeah, in German, by the way, we say Fledermaus for bats. So that's very relevant. It's a flying mouse. That's what it is. So yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, let us know what you think of those myths in the comments. Do you believe them? Do you have sort of anecdotal observations for or against them?
Yeah,
Very
we'll
quickly, Pilot
we'll
Man has a question. Do bats migrate? Yes, some
migrate.
of them
Yes.
do.
Yeah, Georgia, we'll take those up in a
Okay.
moment
If you can
because
remember, I
I,
have to
I will.
trust
I
you to
promise you.
remember.
I promise you. I'm keeping track. It's going to be my responsibility. I will do my best. I'm seeing all your questions, so that's great. So just give your answers on myths. In the meantime, let's discuss a little bit. Whilst there's some comments about the myths, let's just discuss. Bats possess extraordinary adaptations. One of them is flight. The most interesting that we know, of course, is the so-called echolocation. That is the use of sound where they can maneuver in complete darkness. So, Georgia, why don't we discuss this incredible ability?
Yeah, so I mean, flying is a big accomplishment. They are the only mammals that have powered flight. So there's some other mammals that have like non-powered flight, by which we mean like they can glide.
Hmm.
So flying quote unquote squirrels are one of these. They have just a wing membrane between their front and back legs, and they kind of can coast down from the tree. But bats are the only, flapping powered flight mammals. So that's pretty impressive.
Hmm.
Um, and then, like you mentioned there, echolocation. So not all bats can use echolocation actually, and like some of
Oh,
the species, some of the bigger like fruit eating bats in the tropics, they. Oh, now I'm trying not to talk about one of the myths early. The blind is a bat, but I mean they don't use echolocation very much. So I wonder what else they might use. Um,
That's
but yeah, but I
okay.
mean, echolocation, if you think of it, it's amazing. And I mean, so they're just emitting these sound waves and kind of, when you are emitting a very high sound wave,
Mhm.
based on how it bounces back, you can get like a lot of information about your environment. So like high frequency sound bounces back very easily against stuff. Low frequency sounds, right, can travel really far. Part of, and Christian, you can correct me, part of why they're traveling so far is they're not like the low frequency sound isn't
Completely correct.
bouncing back against stuff quite to the same degree. And so, bats are interested in not in their sounds going really far, but they're interested in like what's around me, like where are the trees, where's the things I have to avoid, where's like the little insect that I want to eat that's like near me. So they have this really high frequency echolocation calls that they're using to get that information.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. This is what fascinates me most of all. So I'll talk a little bit about the science here. So typically scientists measure sound in decibels, okay? So let me just explain what decibels is, and then I'll explain to you also about frequency, and then we'll take an overview. I'm just going to try and get the one scale in for us. Let's see if I can do this quickly. Oh no, let's get the other one, get rid of this one. Oh yeah, can you put that, you're better at this, put that one in the middle, the one on
Oh
decibels.
yes, I got
Yeah,
it.
thank you, Georgia.
Oh, you got
So,
it right here.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So let me explain a little bit. So the ear is very similar to the eye. It's a logarithmic sensor, so it means it's not linear. So if I double something, it's not perceived as double, and this gives us the incredible ability to see things or also to hear things over a very wide range, and that's why we measure them in decibels, which is actually a logarithmic scale. So the way this works is 0 decibels means our ear can't hear anything. It doesn't mean there's no sound. It just means we cannot perceive anything. If there's something like 10 decibels, it is actually 10 times as loud. So now you're going to say 20 decibels is 20 times as loud. No, it's not. It's 100 times louder, right? It's logarithmic. Every time you jump 10, you are going by the power of 10. So here it comes. Our normal conversation that we're having now is about 50 to 60 decibels, right? That is our normal room. Now, you'll be surprised if I tell you that bats, and Georgia just defined that. So that goes, there are some bats that don't actually use echolocation, but they emit a frequency that is way above what we can hear, and it's also extremely loud. It really is. It is deafening loud. We can be happy that we cannot listen to this. So our frequency range goes somewhere between 20 and 20 kilohertz. A bat goes way above that, all the way to 120 kilohertz. So that is very high. That's 5, 6 times way above. And if we were to listen and stand right next to a bat, it would be louder. I really mean it, louder than someone putting a trumpet into your ear. Our eardrums would just pop. They go all the way to 150 decibels. That is 10 to the power of 15 times more than the lowest scale. I mean, that's just mind-boggling. So we would basically, our eardrums would pop. Fortunately, we don't hear that. And now comes the interesting thing. How do bats actually cope with their own screaming? I mean, when they scream, they are putting so much energy into this, so their metabolic rate goes up by a factor of 6 to 10. So the oxygen intake that they do, that's very interesting in order to emit this. But as far as I understand, the pulse that they emit is only very short, and in order not to be deafened, imagine you screaming so loud that you go deaf on your own sound. That's what it is, right? And in order for that not to happen with a bat, it actually has the ability just before it emits the sound to have a muscle that closes the membrane so that it doesn't get deafened by its own sound. Now you're going to ask me, and I don't know the answer of this, how come it doesn't get deafened by the other bats around it? I haven't found the answer yet. But anyway, I just had to explain that very quickly.
No, I thought that was really great, and that diagram is really really helpful and useful. There was a lot of kind of commentary and chatter in the bat world recently about, we had the holiday, the 4th of July here in the United States recently, where people were setting off all these fireworks at night. And, there's a lot of talk now, which like the animals are scared of the fireworks and there are these loud booming noises. Like, how does it affect the bats? it must be terrible for them because it interferes with their echolocation.
Yes.
And some people were saying that. And I mean, it turns out, at least among this like group of like, 30 bat biologists or something who are sort of commenting on this, no one really knows of a good study where they tried to look at this. But there were some people, saying, well, it must really affect them because these fireworks are so loud. But then there was other people saying, well, they're actually, the fireworks are quite low compared to the calls that the bats make, like in terms of the frequency of the sound. Much of the, it's like kind of a low like boom for us. And so actually the bats like might not notice it that much. And that actually kind of anecdotally matches. There was one night when I went out to try to record some bat calls, and we actually had a comment from Kit, can you record a bat's high frequency so that we can hear? Yes, we can, Kit. And so this is what I was out and about doing that night. I had my special recorder. I wasn't catching any bats. I was just using my special microphone to see like what bats were around calling. And I was so annoyed. I was like, gosh, these fireworks keep messing up with my recordings, because I'll get like a beautiful feeding call and then it just the microphone picks up like the loudest sound. And I was like, these fireworks are like messing up my recordings. And then I was like, wait a second, it's the 4th of July. What in the world am I doing out here? I'm supposed to be like celebrating or having a life or something. And then second of all, there's all these bats out here apparently just kind of going about their business, emitting their hunting calls and stuff, and despite the fireworks. So those bats at least didn't seem to mind too much. And then I quickly pulled up, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but this is a device, and you can see my ring light, I'll turn it off. This is a device that we use to record the bat calls. Actually, let me make this
really
bigger. Oops.
Oh, now you made yourself disappear, which is a pity. But
I know.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, there we go. So, all right, so these little like blips, these kind of blips along here, it's a shame we can't see a little bit better. Maybe I'll try to put up a picture. But the little like blips along here are like the bat calls. So, and then like the noise down there, this is kind of, there's a bunch of stuff down at the bottom that's just kind of like stuff in the range of human hearing. But this device is one example of multiple different devices that we have that we can use to record bat calls. It's called the company is Anabat, and this is an Anabat walkabout. It's an Australian company, I believe, but there's other devices too. So yeah, like each one of these, I wonder if I can zoom in a bit. Okay, so this is just kind of zooming in on the call. So you can change between like logarithmic scales. So that kind of long line is the bat call now, is one of the bat calls. And there's like stuff below it that's just noise. And if we keep scrolling around, we see like there's the next bat call back there. Yeah, it's a bit hard to do on the screen. So they're emitting like a bunch of like chirps, basically very high frequency, to get like that, all the different information back. Yeah.
And that is so interesting, Georgia. I didn't know such an instrument existed. I'm a terrible person for geeks, so that's probably the next thing I'm going to get. It's probably very expensive, but anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, this one, don't get this. So there are some cheaper ones now. This one, this was actually one that I was given for free when they were trying to like develop this product to like see how it worked, for feedback and stuff. But there's another company called Wildlife Acoustics that makes some relatively cheap ones, like less than $200 that actually plug into your smartphone. And so you can turn your smartphone into a bat detector with these Wildlife Acoustics Echometer touch units. I'm not being paid by anyone, but
no, that's absolutely fascinating. I'm just going, gosh, there's so much interesting stuff to talk about. I mean, one thing that I find fascinating, you were just saying it emits sort of pulses. What I find interesting is, I mean, bats are flying, I'm just thinking now, somewhere between 3 and 5 meters per second. It's about, well, for those of you, it's between 15 and 40 feet per second, when they go fast. So if they emit this sound and there's an insect, which obviously is the reason why they're doing that mainly flying at night, they would only have 1 second to correct their maneuver. And also, what is so interesting is they are able to use, at least that's my understanding, even the Doppler effect, which means if the insect is moving, which it is, of course, in the air, they can detect changes in direction and the size and everything by emitting the sounds. I find that mind-boggling, right? So,
Yeah, and we have a question from Frankman. Can any other animals hear the bat's high frequency and avoid them? I believe that there are, I mean, I'm sure that there are a number of insects that can hear the high frequencies and maybe other animals too, but there certainly insects are the ones who are interested in avoiding the bats. And I believe, I'm almost certain that the insects can try to avoid, like behaviorally when they hear the bat. Like you can sort of see videos sometimes where the moth is like diving or something. But there's even insects that have special adaptations on their wings where their wings can sort of
it's like a stealth mode. It's like a stealth mode, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, like part of that, well, their wings, some of them have very quiet wings, but some of them have like wings that are quiet, but then like part of their wing stands out a lot to the bat. And it's like the back part of their wing that they don't need very much. And like you'll see like some of the wings that have like a long, like sort of tail on them. Like those, I wonder if I can find a picture, but like those moth wings with a really long tail on them, those are kind of designed for the bat to attack like the tail rather than the body of the moth. And so the moth can kind of go on and keep living then. I actually don't want to look up a picture because I don't know enough about the moths to be like, this is definitely a species of moth that does that. And some plants actually have taken advantage of this. So like, I'm going to look up real quick, like a bat pollinated flower of a cactus.
Yeah, so whilst you do that, I'm just going to read out some of the comments so we don't lose them.
Oh, yeah.
Look, we are absolutely delighted that so many comments are coming in. So we obviously hit a very interesting topic here, which doesn't surprise me. So the first one, I'm just going to go through the comments now, was, yes, the one question we're going to pick up now later is from Pilotman. Do bats migrate? The answer is yes, they do. But we'll talk a bit about that too. And then Kit Harvey says completely correctly, crazy as a bat. So that's talking about myths. We'll get right back to the myths in a moment.
The myths are coming up. Yeah. So maybe we should refresh what they're again. Bats fly in your hair. Bats.
Yes, that's correct. Yes. As blind as a bat. I mean, that's a big myth, right? Bats flying into your hair. So, Georgia, has a bat ever been entangled in your hair?
No, it has not. But okay, real quick, I want to bring up this is, and I apologize, I don't know what the source is for this image, but we can see a bat here visiting this cactus flower. So this is a flower on a cactus that's pollinated by bat, and the flower is very smooth. So it bounces back the sound really well to the bat because it's like, oh, this nice smooth sound reflective surface. But you notice the part of the cactus around the flower is very fuzzy. So that part of the cactus kind of just absorbs or muffles the sound. And
it looks like a sound room. It looks like a sound room.
Yeah, that cactus is like a little sound room effect going on. So to the bat, that flower stands out like, so that's kind of like a sign of sort of like from an evolutionary sense, like how beneficial it is for this cactus to have sort of, developed this way for its flowers, who it wants the bats to come to the flowers to pollinate it. It's really beneficial for these bats to come and visit their flowers and pollinate them and stuff. And it brings me real quick before we get to the myths. This is another really important human bat interaction thing. Bats are the only pollinator of the agave flower. And so there's like some birds that visited and stuff, but like hummingbirds visit, but they're not actually very good pollinators. So if you like tequila, we always say you have bats to thank for tequila because they're the ones who are helping those plants that you get the agave nectar from to make tequila. The bats are the ones that are helping pollinate those agave plants and helping them survive. So there are some initiatives out there. If you search for like bat-friendly tequila, there are some initiatives out there to try to leave some more of like the agave flowers like standing for longer instead of harvesting them. That way the bats have like the agave nectar to drink as they're migrating along actually that route in Mexico. So
That's fascinating. So next time we drink a tequila, we're going to drink to the bats. That's incredible.
yeah, you say, thank you, bats. So the
Wonderful.
myths finally though, right?
Yes, the myths. Let's get to them. Has a bat actually been caught in your hair ever?
Never, never, ever. And I have caught many bats, probably, thousands of bats at this point, but I've never had a bat caught in my hair. Not even when I'm in like the little tiny caves, and the bats are kind of like freaking out because they're flying all around and there's not very much space. They almost fly into me sometimes, because they're, there's not very much room, but they have never crashed into me. They've never gotten tangled in my hair. So that's a complete myth. Would I believe it that maybe a bat, like, I don't know, accidentally bounced into someone's head once? That might happen. I actually had a friend who is a bat biologist who was jogging at night, and he claims that a bat flew into his head when he was jogging. So I don't know. Like, I'm sure that maybe that's, I always like to think there must be some truth in myths, but, some people think quite erroneously that the bats want your hair to build a nest in it or something. Bats don't build nests. There are no nest building species of bats. So then they're certainly not seeking you out in any way. They're terrified of you. You're, giant compared to them. So.
And then let's get to the next myth. And that's actually, I'm going to read out the question here from Gentleman Ghost. My big question that is relevant is how much are bats prone to transmit diseases? Are they more than animals? That is what everybody asks. So here's the myth number 3. Bats pose a major threat of rabies to humans. So Georgia, it's all yours. Go.
Yeah. So, like a lot of things, it kind of depends on how you slice it. So humans can get diseases from a very wide variety of animals. And we can kind of especially get diseases from mammals like bats because they're closely related to us and we can share diseases just because of that potentially. But rabies in the United States, at least, and in many other countries, you're more likely to get rabies from a dog than a bat. And part of that is because we come into contact with dogs so much. This certainly bats can carry rabies though. I want to be clear about that. But the level in a lot of populations is actually very low. So here in Michigan, for example, in the northern part of the United States, about 1,000 bats are submitted for rabies testing every year. And less than 2% of them test positive for rabies. I believe actually less than 1%. So if we think about it, that's like, first of all, even that probably means even less than 1% of bats just in the wild population have rabies. But that number, that 1% number is probably really inflated. It's probably actually pretty high because that's, we're measuring that out of the bats that people already suspect have rabies. It's 1% of the bats that people submit for rabies testing that we say, oh, wait, we think this bat might have rabies. Let's kill it and test it for rabies. And only 1% of those have it. So in the wild, in the United States, at least, the number is probably, much lower than that in the wild. And another kind, thank you so much, Jay, for the Waterworks Award. We really appreciate it. But
thank you very much.
Yeah. But like another thing is that, bats actually suffer from rabies like we do. Like bats will be like negatively affected by the disease and die. So some people think that, bats just aren't affected by rabies at all. And so they're just kind of like traveling around there doing fine, potentially spreading it all around. I thought maybe it says accident meant to be the fascinating award. Well, maybe you're sad. I didn't know. Maybe you're sad that like for the people who have rabies or bats getting rabies or something. But yeah, I mean, so the bats and rabies thing is, just like you're more likely to get rabies from a dog in most places, and the background level is pretty low. So there are some species that have rabies at higher rates than others. So vampire bats, which are in the neotropics, so like in South Central America, and I believe they come up into Mexico. But vampire bats, because they're regularly biting and drinking blood from other animals, they have higher rates of rabies compared to other species of bats. But even vampire bats are negatively affected by the disease, yeah. And they'll, die from it.
Right.
In terms of, I guess, other diseases, so bats have, if you look at like the proportion of, oh, you're highlighting a comment here, bats
Yes,
are,
it's just
yeah.
very nice to do it whilst you talk, so don't be distracted, please.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, so bats, if you look at like per species of bat, how many diseases there are, it's actually not higher than other mammals. So like Christian, you mentioned at the beginning, you were surprised to learn that there's, over 1,000 different species of
Yes,
bats.
yes.
I think, bats are the second largest group of mammals
Mhm.
in terms of how many species they have. So rodents are number one and bats number two. So it just means like by sheer volume of numbers, they're going to have a lot of different diseases because they have a lot of different species. So it kind of, more recently, there have been studies that show like, oh, if we actually control for how many different species of bats there are, there's not more diseases than you would expect.
Right,
Does that make, I
right.
hope that makes sense, Christian?
Yeah,
Yes?
that makes complete sense. Well, that's actually very good news. So let's get to the strength of bats, and they have unique. Well, they have extreme longevity, which is interesting. So they are very resistant against aging and cancer. Is there anything you could say about that? That's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, so I mean, they don't really, they develop like cancer less than we do, and they can actually live very long too. So typically,
Hmm.
smaller mammals live shorter lifespans, and I think that's pretty intuitive to people. They think of, your pet dog maybe lives 8 to 10 years or something for depending on the size, and even small dogs live. They tend to not live as long as big dogs sometimes, and like and if you think of like a mouse or a rat, it lives only a few years. But bats, many of them are just the size of a mouse. Bats can
Yes,
live over 30 years of the species.
that's incredible.
Yeah, this in the species I study, the little brown bat, it actually can live. Forget actually what the maximum record is, but definitely like 34 years.
Wow.
We have some recorded living that long. So some of the bats are older than I am that I study. And I mean, part of that is certainly linked to hibernation. So animals that spend part of their life just sort of torpid or in hibernation, or with their like sort of basic metabolic functions suppressed, they tend to
Yes.
live long. So there's some species of salamanders that also live a long time, and they're also species that hibernate in winter. So part of it is when you hibernate in the winter, when you shut down in winter, you're kind of borrowing time. You're escaping in time. You've like cryogenically frozen yourself in a sense. But even with that, it seems that maybe because they hibernate, they have some special sort of cellular repair mechanisms and stuff
Hmm.
that potentially, allow them to use that time to sort of like repair damage and stuff. And then and maybe that's linked to some of the disease stuff too. If you think about it, if you're like a disease trying to live in a host body, for most mammals, if you're a disease in a body, that means that you get this wonderfully consistent environment, relatively consistent internal body temperature. But if you're living inside a bat, if you're a disease living inside a bat, that bat's body temperature just is going to plummet once a year. And so that's potentially makes it difficult for some diseases to survive. And so I will say too that like even though I mentioned that the number of diseases that bats have isn't that different than other mammals, once you control for how many species, the types of diseases that bats have are different. And there are some other recent studies that show that of the viruses bats do carry, some of them do tend to be more virulent than other viruses. So some of the diseases they carry can be sort of particularly bad for humans, and that might be because of how the disease had to adapt to live with bats. I wrote kind of
Ah,
a little
right.
bit longer piece on this. Let me share it real quick. This
Yeah,
is
sure.
something I did just like a year ago, and I can put the link in the chat too right
Yes.
now. But this was just, and if you go to this link, you'll have to scroll down a lot. But the piece is just called "Bats and Disease." Like, what's the deal? And
Ah,
that
there we go.
Yeah, and that goes over some of the stuff I talked about with like, you know, looking at the studies that control for how many different species of bats there are and stuff, and some of the diseases being more virulent. So definitely, you know, take a look at that if you're interested. I wonder, can everyone see the comments, do you think, or should we highlight the comment, or is it, it's kind of a
Uh,
long link?
I think it's fine, George.
Okay.
I think it's fine. I'm just going through. I've just presented
Okay.
another. I'm just going back here so I don't lose the other question. 1 second. I just put Barbara's question up, where I think, as far as I recall it now, is whether bats actually come after you, because that's often what people believe, right? So.
Yeah, they don't come after you. Someone very early on mentioned that they have bats in their house. Certainly, some species kind of like to be in houses, and that's because a lot of species like live in dead trees or caves,
Mm-hmm.
and depending on the type of house you have, it can kind of imitate those environments. So, you know, the inside of a house can be kind of like a cave. You know, it has higher humidity, it's cooler, and things like that. And so, and also, and sometimes, you know, the bats just get lost just like any other animal, especially if you have your lights on at night and there's a lot of insects flying around and you have your back door open or something. The bats might kind of accidentally like come inside. Yeah.
Okay, so that's another myth. What is interesting, Georgia, what I found very interesting and completely took me by surprise, at the typical offspring rate for bats is about 1 per year. Is that correct, or?
Yeah, so it depends where you are. So some species
Mhm.
have twins, and
Okay.
and one species I know of, at least in this area, can have quadruplets. And I'll share, I forgot to share this picture earlier. This is a picture of me from my early bat days with a species called the eastern red bat. And you can see it's a little bit reddish in color. It's kind of found like throughout the United States. But the eastern red bat can have twins or quadruplets depending on the area. I think out west they have more babies, maybe because it's just warmer and stuff. But yeah, a lot of bats only have one offspring per year. And so there's sort of, people tend to sort of falsely equate bats with mice, and they think, oh,
Yes,
it's like a mouse flying around and it has a bunch of babies. And but it's kind of
that's
the
right.
opposite. Bats live a long time and have very few babies, as opposed to like a mouse, which lives a very short time and has a lot of babies to try to, you know, that's what it has to do. If you're only living a little bit, you got to pump out all the babies really quickly. But bats, yeah, they have it one baby and they kind of, you know, they spend a long time like nursing the baby. There's evidence that like once the baby knows how to fly, they'll kind of, the parents will like fly around like with the baby, not just carrying the baby, but like sort of like this is, you know, like showing them like how to forage and eat and stuff like that. And so that kind of, you know, that kind of stuff is pretty interesting, and I think highlights the importance of being a little bit more like compassionate towards a lot of these animals and protecting them, because when you only have one baby a year, you can't really afford to be like having your population just sort of cut by white nose syndrome or any of these other threats or climate change that we see some of the bat populations dealing with now.
That's really interesting. So my question right on to that is, because I'm much more in the raptor world, is there, do they really, I mean, the offsprings, the little ones, the juveniles, whatever you want to call them, is there such a thing for them as branching, you know, developing to fly, or do they suddenly just know how to fly?
You know, that's a great question. I'm not sure. There's
Oh,
no,
good,
I've
I
never
caught you off.
seen,
That's
yeah, no,
possible.
it's okay. I've never seen
That's
any
okay.
cute pictures, like when you see like the cute
Right.
pictures of like the baby owls learning to fly and the kind of like
Mhm.
being all awkward. I haven't seen any of those with bats, and it might just be that that footage is harder to get. Um,
Right. Yeah, I'm just curious. You know, this is just so, gosh, there's so many questions coming up. Also, the way they hang upside down in caves, where do they learn that from?
Yeah, well, when it comes to the hanging upside down, they don't really have a choice because, and part of that is because like their pelvic bones are so small and narrow that they can't really stand any other way. So birds have this great adaptation where their bones are quote unquote hollow. Their bones are very light, but bats never figured out how to make like their bones really light. So instead they had to just reduce the bones they did have. And one of the biggest bones that's easy to reduce is your pelvic bone. And so they got
Oh,
these really
right.
dinky little pelvises. And so then they just kind of like have to hang upside down because there's no way they can stand. Um,
That, yeah, Kit comes up with a great question. You're going to be bombarded with questions. I'm going to present that one on the screen. So just hang on 1 second. So this is a typical eagle question. Do they mate for life? Is there such a thing as a family in the bats world?
so um, I don't know of any bats that mate for life like birds
Right.
do, but they do have the females, at least especially here in the northern US, the females will form what we call maternity colonies. So a bunch of the moms with their babies will get together and they'll like raise the babies kind of together. And often this will happen in like a particularly like great dead tree or something, a great dead tree from a bat's perspective. And you know that tree is great because it's like big and like that's high up off the ground from predators, and maybe it gets
Right.
lots of sunlight, and so it stays really warm inside like the dead part of the tree for the baby bats. Um, so a lot of times we have, yeah, the family, I guess you could say the maternity colony is like a family perhaps, and the moms like recognize the baby bats calls. Um, the closest kind of so like vampire bats have actually really sort of well-developed social networks. And I think even
Oh,
then though, like the males are sort of like less involved in the social group in certain senses, and the females will do a lot of like food sharing between adults and between juveniles and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, oftentimes the male bats are kind of like more so out of the picture. And it kind of works out well because what the male bats do is they sort of spread out and they're just like in other places on the landscape or in the forest. They're kind of often like the crappier habitat, you know? So in a way it kind of works well because these males are out there sort of living their bachelor life and maybe not living in as like nice of habitat, but then you don't have very much competition for food and stuff like that, like in the good, nice habitat, that's kind of reserved for the moms and the babies. So from an evolution and like survival of the fittest perspective, it makes sense to have it that way.
by the way, we just have Pablo and Peter joining us. Wonderful. Thanks. We feel honored that you are here with us. That is great. And Peter just thanks for the awards too. And Peter just put a question there. What kind of bat is it there that you're holding, Georgia?
Yeah, it's an eastern red bat. I'm putting it
Hmm.
in the comments, and I think that it's just a really beautiful species of bat. It's really widespread. I think it's hard to tell. I think that's a male in the picture. It's one of the few species of bats that has sexual dimorphism in the coloration. That
Oh,
means that often we see this in birds, right, where the males are really pretty
yes.
bright colors.
Yes.
Well, this is the same for this species. Not quite so extreme, but the males are like brighter red, and then the females are like kind of red and kind of gray. And so it's weird because like we don't really know why their coloration is so different when they're active at night. And well, I guess we never got back to the myth of like how well can bats see, but bats can see probably about as well as you or me, but like
Yes.
I can't see
Yes.
that well at night. Like I don't think I could see the color differences
No,
at night.
that's
So
correct. Yes.
yeah, so it's still a bit of a mystery why they're colored so differently. Um, and I will say that some fruit bats actually have better vision than us. And that makes sense too, because they're out at night looking for like fruit, or some of them looking for flowers. And so some bats can actually see better than we can. Um, but yeah, back to the eastern red bat real quick. So these bats actually they'll hang just like in the leaves of maple trees or just trees in general. And so because they're kind of reddish, they kind of look like just a dead leaf hanging there, right? And so their coloration is also involved in like camouflage and making them look just sort of like a little dead leaf hanging in the tree somewhere.
Ah, interesting. Okay, well, let's talk about the subject now about humans and wildlife. So we come to humans and bats. And how do humans and bats actually interact with each other? And what is the influence on them?
Yeah, so I mean, the number one kind of commentary I get from people as a bat
Mhm.
biologist is people want to tell me stories or ask me questions about the bat they had in the house, the bat they saw near their house, the bat that they saw like, flying around the streetlight outside their house.
Hmm.
And another HAPS broadcaster, Deanna, actually, the most recent example of this was a couple days ago when Deanna sent me some footage that someone had sent her, and it was of a bat in India, and these people were wondering, like, what's up with this bat? Does it need help? This bat outside their house. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Let me... Okay. And so go to the beginning of the video and make sure the volume's up. Okay, so this is in northern India.
Can they see? Should we put it on the screen altogether?
Oh, can you see it?
There.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll replay it a couple of times. So yeah, you can see this bat is like, and I guess they said that it was raining this day, so they were wondering if like the bat couldn't fly because of the rain, or if the bat was hurt. You can kind of see he's like using his claws and his thumbs and his feet to sort of just like hang off of these pots that are on their back deck or whatever. And so what I said is, I was like, I'm not that familiar with bats of the area, but most bats have a lot of trouble taking off from the ground. They're not like a bird where they can just sort of like fly off of the ground. What they need is to sort of like drop down and get some momentum and fly. So they need like some air rushing under their wings oftentimes to get like a good flight. And so that bat, it ended up on the ground probably somehow, and it didn't have anything it could climb up nearby that was tall enough to do that. And so, and later, a little bit after that, she shared a photo with me of the bat had managed to find like a fence to climb up. Unfortunately, it was like a barbed wire fence. So I hope that it didn't get like tangled up in the barbed wire, but the same bat did kind of make it. He's not tangled here though. He's just kind of like hanging from the top of the fence. So that bat did make it. He found a fence. He found something like taller to climb up. And presumably, at night or when the weather's nicer, he's going to like fly out of there or find someplace even higher to fly out of. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. So, I mean, the number one question I get is like, people who have encountered bats in their house or on their property, and they don't have a good sense of like, is this bat injured? Is it in trouble? A lot of times I'll get a video or a picture of a bat on a porch, and he's just kind of hanging under someone's porch or something, and they'll be like, oh, I think this baby bat is lost. And I'm like, that's one of the adult daddy bats that's just sort of like flying around, hanging out wherever, because often people don't realize like how small many of the species are. And so, so I get like a lot of questions about those things. And usually the bat is fine. And if the bat is in your house, obviously that's not fine for you. You can try to, have a door open, and the bat is probably, especially if it's flying around, it's trying to get out of the house. So you can leave a door open or something like that. Some people use like a broom to try to shoo them. Some people throw like a light sheet or something over the bat that kind of like forces it to the ground, and then they can just kind of like grab the sheet and bring it outside, making sure that, wearing gloves and stuff, that way the bat doesn't accidentally like bite you through the sheet or something. Luke says that their bats are mouse sized. That's like in the northern US, that's the only kind of bat we have is like small mouse sized bats.
Yeah, so that's probably also why bats do better, because they're nocturnal. And that's when humans are not that much around. At least they shouldn't be so active. So then the question, of course, arises, are there specific species of bats that actually can benefit from human beings?
Oh, yes. So there are some bats. So I've mentioned a couple times vampire bats.
Yes, you have.
And the vampire bats are an example of a species that's done really well with humans, actually, because people in the neotropics in those areas, like in other places of the world, have a lot more cattle grazing going on. And so the vampire bats have access to all these like cows. They used to try to find these like small, like, highly aware deer in the forest. but now they have all these cows. And so vampire bats have this great food resource that they didn't have before. So they have become more common, and they're expanding their range, probably at least in part because of all of this livestock. And then other species of vampire bats will actually eat chickens as well. And I should say, I don't want to talk too much about vampire
Chickens?
bats. Yeah.
Really?
So there's 3 species of vampire bats, and I think 2 of them maybe specialize on birds, or maybe one of them, and then the other one specializes on mammals. But I don't want to talk too much about vampire bats because we have actually a vampire bat expert coming to talk to us on the Humans and Wildlife show soon.
We'll do that.
Yeah, we'll play. I forget the date off the top of my head. It's going to be sometime in August, though, I believe. So vampire bats are one example. We'll hear more about that some Wednesday in August. And another example is actually some of the species that I study, like the little brown bat, have started to use mines, like iron and copper mines that people built. They started using those to hibernate in. And those mines were made like before we really studied bats that well. So we don't really know, like, did their numbers like increase hugely because all of these like mines were around in an area that didn't have very many caves before? They need those underground sites to shelter in during the winter here because it gets so cold. And so we don't really know, like, did their range expand because of these new like underground sites that people were developing? Certainly overall, the little brown bat, the one I study, it's doing worse because of humans. And that's because of the white nose disease we brought over. But maybe there was a period sort of before that where it was doing better than it used to because of these mines. But certainly it's doing very, very poorly now.
Well, that's fascinating. So, I mean, that brings us right to the topic, because obviously the human beings are also a big threat for bats, and we now understand that bats are not the Dracula figure that we like to make out of it, and that many, including, well, maybe even myself, have certain preconceived ideas. And the more you start reading, the more you get fascinated with bats. So, what can we actually do to help protect bats?
Yeah, so like a lot of it is going to depend on where you are, right? But so certainly like kind of the most common one, right, is you can like donate money. So there's an organization, Bat Conservation International is probably the biggest, like the biggest like bat nonprofit I know of.
Okay.
And, they do habitat protection and education and things like that. And then certainly, there might be someplace more local to you. There's like, for example, in Florida, there's like the Luby Bat Conservancy. And so those things are always helpful. And there's some evidence out there too that for animals that are so like have such a bad public image, they sometimes do need focused conservation efforts. So there's a lot of good, conservation organizations you can donate to that like just protect wildlife broadly. But sometimes for animals, the animals like bats sometimes end up getting kind of overlooked because they sort of have special like protection needs because people just are so like unhappy with them. Oh yeah, and Luke brings up a really good additional thing you can do, which Luke says, I've seen things from the highway that I think are bat houses. So those might be bird houses, like bluebird houses, but certainly there's also like bat houses that people put up now. And a bat house is basically someplace where, because a lot of species of bats, especially the ones that eat insects, a lot of species of bats like to live in like the dead, decaying bark of the tree. But what do we do as people? We cut down dead trees. And sometimes for good reasons. We don't want dead trees like crumbling and falling on our houses or whatever. But when possible, leave dead trees because they are fantastic resources for wildlife. There's a lot of animals that use like the nooks and crannies that develop as the tree starts to rot. And I mean, it might sound disgusting, but like as the insects are like eating at the bark and stuff, like those insects are good food resources for other animals, and maybe you like insects and you want them around. So if possible, leave dead trees. And animals like bats use them. But if you don't want dead trees around, then a bat box kind of mimics that because it creates like a space where the bat the bats can hang out as if they were like in the sort of bark of the tree that's sloughing off. And I wonder, actually, I might just do another screen share real quick
Yes,
to show what
sure.
a bat house looks like, because I think probably a lot of people don't know. So here's an example of one. Okay, so here's an example of a bat house.
Oh, wow.
And it's hanging upside down, and the bats are gonna land in, like, this picture is kind of annoying actually, but because it moves, but they're gonna land in this part under the bat box. There's like some grippy surface there. The bats will land there and then crawl up into the bat box. And basically in that big hole area, that's what's imitating like a dead tree. Because you have it sort of an outer area that's like the dead bark of the tree getting heated up, and then you have this area underneath that's like between the other wood of the tree and the bark. So that's like an example of a bat house.
That's fascinating. Just a quick question, then we'll move on to some other questions. So with that bat house, what prevents other animals from making it their house? How do bats know this is mine?
Yeah, so one of the things that the bats look for when they're deciding whether or not to use the bat house is how high up it is. So the bat house being high up makes it unlikely that other animals like raccoons will be able to crawl up in there. The predator that usually sometimes can get into them are snakes, but I don't see it very often. And a lot of times bats will they like to have actually multiple bat houses in an area, because the moms, especially like the moms in the maternity colony, they'll kind of all move from bat house to bat house. So they like to like switch their location as well, and that helps prevent like a predator from knowing like, oh yeah, all the bats are going to come back here tonight. Like I'm going to wait at this bat box. Because they're sort of switching locations within an area, it makes it harder for predators to find them.
Excellent. So let's take two final questions. The one is directly, let's answer that one first, because Gentleman Ghost said, what animals are predators of bats? And then we'll follow it by Kit's question specifically about pesticides, because that's always a big question for raptors. Do they, if they kill insects and so on, does it go up the food chain? That's a question. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Kit, yes, it seems that, pesticides are bad for bats for a couple reasons. One, pesticides kill insects, and that's literally what the bats eat. And then two, you're right. Bats, like the pesticides can kind of build up in their bodies. If they're eating all these different insects that have a little bit of pesticides on them, then that's not going to be good for the bat. And Christian we touched on this a little bit in the last episode when we were talking about poisoning rodents and how that can hurt the raptors that are, eating the rodents. It's the same thing with insects and bats. I think that it's a little bit harder to link it as like a cause, because the bats are like eating so many tiny insects, and it's hard to say like, oh yeah, it ate a poisoned insect and then it keeled over dead. But it's, it looks like it's probably not good for the bat to be, consuming all these like pesticides that are building up bit by bit in the body with each insect they eat. And then
the other one was about predators. What type of predators do bats have?
Yeah, so James's question about predators. Well, so it looks like they don't have that many predators. That was part of why they're active at night. There's less predators around. But the ones that they do have, so owls are probably one of the big ones, because owls are active at night and they can presumably, try to get the bat. And sometimes they do eat bats. And certainly like cats and dogs have gotten some bats, like especially if the bat gets into a person's house, the cat or dog can get it. And in some areas, I worked at this cave in Puerto Rico where the entrance to the cave was close to the ground, and like cats, there were feral cats that were around, like trying to get the bats as they came out of the cave, because they were like kind of close to the ground as they came out of the cave. And I heard of a study that someone did where they put a bunch of cat litter boxes around the entrance to the cave. And that way they could look at the poop of the cats to see how many bats they were eating. I guess this is a weird thing. Like even feral stray cats are like, litter box, that's like the best place to poop that I could imagine. And so then they'll go in the litter box, and the scientists are like, oh, look at all this cat poop I collected. It's great. So yeah, so in some cases you can get cats eating a lot of bats. And that same cave actually also has a species of snake that is highly specialized in eating bats. And the snakes will be hanging all around the outside of the cave, waiting for the bats to come out. And that species of snake is actually like, I think, an endangered species in Puerto Rico or something. I wish I could remember what it's called, but I don't. But yeah, and like raccoons can eat bats, but a lot of times I think it's more of a threat for the baby bats because they can't like fly away. And yeah, but they don't really have a lot of predators. Like I think a lot of bats just sort of live to old age. Yeah.
Interesting. And here, I just put it on the screen too. Luke has a question: do bats drink water, or do they get everything they need from bugs?
Yeah, bats do drink water, and so that's another really important habitat component. Is they actually often drink on the wing. So if you have like a smooth lake or something, they will come and like swoop and skim the surface of the water and drink. And you can see like in an area with a lot of bats around, actually like there's almost like a lot of bats, like especially at the start of the night, they're all thirsty. There's a lot of bats kind of flying, and they kind of form like almost like they're taking turns like at an airport runway or something. There'll be one and there'll be another one, and they'll all kind of like go in sequence like in the same area, like they're kind of like taking turns or something. But if there's a lot of like duckweed or like plants growing on the top of the water, that sometimes happens when you have like bad water quality, the bats can't drink basically. If it's not very easy for them to drink if there's just like a lot of like gunk or algae on top of the water, so they do kind of need like a clean water source. Yeah.
But that's interesting because Kit says they drink from my fish pond and waterfall. So there you go.
Lovely. That's nice.
That's
Yeah, and
great.
I mean, in areas where it's really hot too, like I know like droughts and stuff in Australia are really problematic for the big bats. And I assume, I don't know that much about how bats there end up drinking, how those bigger bats drink, but I think that like water must be hard for them to get, and like maybe they get more creative. I've heard of bats drinking from swimming pools all over the world. That seems disgusting
Wow.
to me, but they seem
Wow.
fine with it. I don't know.
Yeah, Franklin says, can I catch wild cats? He means bats, or obviously bats, by placing a cardboard box too. You know, he's probably tongue in cheek here, but
Yeah, I'm not sure. I bet you could, because they do seem to like it, but I guess you'd still have to like, I don't know, find them. You know, they won't stay there for long, so you have to find them at the right moment. Yeah.
yeah, I'm just going to put up one more comment here. This is really an interesting one. Should be up here. I once read that bats re-entering a cave filled with thousands of other bats can hear and identify their baby's cry and go right to it. I think that is wonderful. Yes.
Yeah, so they recognize each other by the call the mom and the babies do. And yeah, in some of these caves, like in especially in tropical areas where the moms will be raising their babies in caves instead of like trees or something, there's just, you know, thousands and thousands of bats in there,
Yeah.
and the moms can pick out the baby's call, and it's really kind of amazing. I've also heard of like, there was a friend of a friend who they had like a dead tree fall on their property, and all of these baby bats were just like stuck on the ground because like the moms all flew away. There was like a colony in the tree. And so they didn't know what to do with all these babies. So they collected them all up and put them in a box. And I forget if they left them out there all day or what, but when night came, there was this box with a bunch of babies. And they said the moms started coming to the box and like getting their babies. And every single one of those babies, except for maybe one, like got like picked up by their mom basically.
That's incredible. That brings me again to some science fact here that I read. So if you the hearing of bats is absolutely phenomenal. It's out of this world. There are some types of bats, some species, I don't remember which one it was, but they can hear differences of 0.1 hertz. I mean, this is something you cannot imagine. So just to give you a reference, the tone A that we are, typical for an orchestra that you have is 440 hertz. If I varied this by 1 hertz, I bet none of you would hear the difference. If you go a tenth of it, 0.1 hertz, what I'm saying there is a bat would hear that minute difference. It's absolutely phenomenal, and that explains probably what Georgia was saying there about they're hearing their babies cry at the frequency. So yeah.
Yeah, that probably helps them. And I know that I keep plugging Jerry Carter. Wait, let me look at my messages. The vampire bat guy.
I see.
Yeah, he's going to come Wednesday, August 11th. So if you're interested in hearing more about vampire bats, but he did a really cool study where he found that also like the bats have friends in the group, and they will respond to their friends, but like not so much to the call of bats that aren't their friends. So he did a little playback experiment where like he had the bat in the cave, and then you can hear like it's like, they have a recorder where they play the call of a bat that like is friends with this bat, and the bat in the cage is like, oh, my friend, and is like beep beep and like responds. But if it hears like the call of a bat it like doesn't like it, like kind of like looks up, and then it's like and it like maybe it responds once, but then it like doesn't keep responding. So they recognize, I think they can probably recognize more than just the calls of their babies, which is pretty cool.
Okay, we'll take two more questions, and then I think we'll call it a day, because we're going on over an hour, which really shows, Georgia, you've done an amazing job. That really explains it so well.
Think bats are really interesting. I think, yeah,
they are. So, well, here from Gloria, do you do a document in PBS with the Batman from Mexico and the agave? I don't understand the question, so.
No, yeah, I think so. There's Mexico's Batman. That's Rodrigo.
I see.
I'm gonna scramble his last name. Medellin. It has the two L's. Right. But yeah, Rodrigo is like Mexico's Batman, and he does a lot of stuff with like National Geographic and PBS. I haven't ever done any like visual thing with him before, but he does some really cool stuff. Maybe, I don't know, maybe we can get him on the show. We'll see.
Well, why not? Why not? What a great idea.
We'll see.
And then finally, let me just see, I think that's Janie, if I read it correctly. Can you talk about the sound of the bats we have actually, and the different types of bats? I have a bat that flies around the garden at this time in the summer. Okay.
Yeah, so I think a comment I can add to that is like, I don't know if I ever said it clearly, but the different species do have different species specific calls. Just like with birds, like the different species sound differently. And it can be a bit harder to tell the species apart based on the call for bats, but it is possible. And some of those bat detectors I mentioned, like the wildlife acoustic bat detector that you plug it into your phone and then it like listens to the bat calls, because there's this special microphone that can record their high frequency sounds. That wildlife acoustics unit, it has an automated species ID option, and many of the other ones do, but it will tell you, it will pop up on the screen what species it thinks you're hearing. And it's not, I will say, it's definitely not fail-safe or perfect.
Sure.
But if you go out there and you point the detector up and it's, like 95% of the time it's like, oh yeah, that's a big brown bat, then it's probably a big brown bat. And depending on where you are, if you're in like central or northern United States or Canada, that's probably a good bet, but I'm not sure where you are, Janie. Yeah. And that sort of addresses also the question with the dialects that Franklin was putting up. So obviously that's incredible. I had no idea that these sonar technologies have advanced so much from these recorders. That's probably on my bucket list to get one. Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah, and as Franklin mentioned, I think that some people think they have local dialects. I don't know how well studied it is, but I think certainly it's kind of it's possible, and there's lots of local differences among species. So. Yeah, but their calls shifts a lot depending on if they're like flying in like a forest versus like an open parking lot or something, even because it's a functional call and how much information they need about their environment shifts. So you could have like dialects just for that reason. Like the environment is different where the different populations are, and so they tend to have different calls. Yeah.
Yeah, let me round everything off with a
Yeah.
question to you. So you mentioned in the beginning you're doing your PhD now, and
Mhm.
when it's completed, what is your outlook then? What are you going to do then?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, the plan is to, go on, continue doing research, do some postdoc,
Mhm.
um, become like a professor eventually. It looks like my internet is freezing.
That's
Can
okay.
you?
We can
Okay,
still hear you. It's okay.
you can
Yeah,
hear.
it's fine.
Okay.
Yes.
So
Mhm.
yeah, so that's pretty much the plan is to keep doing research, and I'll throw. I think that. Oh, did I take it away? The image of my paper. I think this is the one image we forgot to show. Which this
Okay.
is the first paper from my PhD. Probably people here aren't interested, but this was.
Oh,
Um,
don't say that. Don't say
oh,
that.
I mean, I don't know. It's like scientific papers are kind of
You're
like.
too modest, Georgia. It'll be
Well,
very
I will say,
interesting. Come
okay,
on.
so this is the research, but I wonder there's also like they did like a lot of like I talked to a lot of reporters about this research, and there's a mental floss article which is, let me just bring it up real
Hmm.
quick because it's realistically this is like the academic paper, and then there's like the you know the like journalist coverages.
Yeah, of
Let
course.
me
Yes.
let me take this away. Screen presenting. Um, why is my internet being so? Um,
Oh,
I
I
think my
don't.
internet might be
Hmm.
like kind of angry, but
Yes, I think that may be it. It's happened to me before.
okay.
Yes. Oh, there you go. You got
Oh,
it.
now it's presenting. Okay, so let me.
Mhm.
So, fat bats might be resistant to Tino syndrome. Where you can find that
Yeah, there we
stuff.
go.
Yeah.
Fat bats might be resistant to deadly white nosing. Oh, that's interesting. I see. Okay.
Yeah. So so that's it. So yeah, hopefully the plan is, keep doing research, keep finding out cool things about bats, and other animals too, as
So
the curiosity
you
lies.
are in you are in your element. You could say you live with your your life is really your job, which you love very much, right? And that's wildlife. That's how I see you. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. I love asking questions about wildlife.
Hmm.
So I'm just like a
That
curious kid still.
that's
So
so
thank you
wonderful.
everybody for coming so much. And oh, do you want to tell people about who we have on next week?
Yes, that's a great idea. So, first of all, thank you to everyone for your questions and your interest. We so appreciate it. We love doing this series, and you've given us also a lot of input on humans and wildlife. We've got a massive list now, so we've got a program that's going to fill many weeks to come. So, thank you so much, and thanks, Frankman, to just give the Broadcast of the Week award. We really appreciate it. So kind of you. Next week we have a very current topic. Um, some of you who are who know eagles, well, you have known that specifically on the Pacific Northwest. There has been crazy temperatures, and you still hear about the wildfires and so on. And that has led, unfortunately, to a lot of turmoil for wildlife there and raptors. The raptor centers are completely overfilled. And one that we're going to talk about next time is OWL. So it's O.W.L. That's the Orphanage Wildlife. I think it's Orphanage Wildlife Center in Delta near Vancouver, and we're going to interview Rob there, who is mainly responsible for the recovery of wildlife there, who's an absolute expert on it. David Hancock actually has brought them due to the incredible numbers of juvenile eagles, merlins, falcons, and so on, hawks that they have collected. David Hancock, who's an eagle biologist, a few days ago drove by with 150 pounds of salmon, right, to help feed them. And people, the public has been very responsive to the needs to help them because the temperature went so high. They fell out, they jumped out of their nests. It's happened everywhere. I've seen it here too. So we'll be talking about the situation, and I think they'll really appreciate your, any donations or any type of contributions that you can give to them. So that's the subject for next Wednesday, exactly at this time, 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, so much. We'll see you next week, hopefully. And
Yes,
don't forget
thank you
to
so
like
much.
and subscribe. Yeah.
Yeah, subscribe to both of us. That'll help. Thank you. And give us lots of thumbs up. That also helps. It motivates. Thank you. Take care.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Okay, bye.